For 8 years, he showed up alone. Rain or shine, promotion or heartbreak, he was always the first one at that gate. She arrived the way she always did, loud, confident, impossible to ignore. And on her arm, a man she was eager to show off.
Wow, look at you.
She wanted an audience to feel small in front of the one person he loved most. But she
3 floors down, in a job he had personally approved, worked the very man his ex-wife thought she was flaunting. The city was smaller.
Daniel Carter had learned, over 8 long years, that humiliation had a very specific sound. It sounded like heels clicking too fast across pavement, like a laugh pitched just a little too loud, like a voice that wanted to be overheard. He heard that sound now, at 4 in the afternoon, standing outside his daughter's elementary school, with her backpack looped over one shoulder and his tie loosened from a day that had already tested every ounce of his patience. If you have ever had to rebuild your life from nothing while the world watched and waited for you to fail, stay with this story until the end, because what happens next will remind you why quiet strength always outlasts loud cruelty. And if it moves you even a little, consider liking this video and subscribing, because stories like this deserve to be heard by more people who need them. 8 years earlier, Daniel's marriage had ended in the ugliest way a marriage can end. Not with a single dramatic betrayal, but with a slow erosion of respect that finally snapped one Tuesday morning when his wife Rachel told him flatly that she had outgrown him. He had been a mid-level manager then, working long hours at a logistics company, coming home smelling of coffee and stress, and somewhere in the grind of providing, he had stopped being interesting to her. She left with a suitcase and a lawyer's number already saved in her phone, and she left him with something far heavier than either of those things, their daughter, Lily, who was 3 years old at the time, and who cried every night for 2 weeks asking where her mother had gone. People assumed Daniel would fall apart. Some of them, like Rachel's sister, said so to his face at the custody hearing, wondering aloud how a man with no family nearby and a demanding job would ever manage to raise a little girl on his own. He said nothing back then. He simply drove home that night, sat on the floor of Lily's nursery, and promised himself 2 things: that his daughter would never doubt she was loved, and that he would never again build his life around anyone else's opinion of him. The years that followed were not easy, and this story will not pretend they were. There were nights Daniel worked from his laptop, propped against the refrigerator while making dinner one-handed. Mornings he showed up to important meetings with spit up on his shoulder that he didn't notice until someone pointed it out, and long stretches where sleep felt like a luxury reserved for people with fewer responsibilities. But somewhere in that exhausting rhythm, something in him sharpened. The same discipline that let him function on 4 hours of sleep began showing up in his work. He stopped accepting excuses from himself and eventually stopped accepting mediocrity from the systems around him. He changed jobs twice, each time trading comfort for opportunity, until at 34 he did something almost nobody who knew him back then would have predicted. He started his own logistic and supply chain consulting firm, built initially out of a spare bedroom with Lily's crayon drawings taped to the wall behind his desk. Rachel, meanwhile, had moved through 2 relationships in those 8 years, both of which ended in the kind of dramatic fallout she seemed to specialize in. She saw Lily on alternating weekends, often late, sometimes not at all, and she filled the gaps in her own story with a narrative that made her look like the free spirit who had escaped a boring, controlling marriage. She never mentioned that the boring, controlling ex-husband had never once been late to a school function, had never missed a doctor's appointment, and had quietly paid for Lily's therapy after the divorce without ever bringing it up at custody meetings to score points against her. By the time Daniel's company had grown into a respected regional firm, 40 employees, 3 office floors, a name that made competitors pay attention, Rachel still pictured him as the same overworked, underappreciated man she had left. She had no idea how much had changed because she had never asked, and pride kept Daniel from ever volunteering the information. He didn't need her to know. He needed Lily to be happy, and by every measure that mattered, she was. A bright, curious 8-year-old who loved dinosaurs, terrible knock-knock jokes, and reading with her father every night before bed. Which brings us back to that Tuesday afternoon outside the school gate. Autumn leaves scattering across the courtyard, other parents chatting near the pickup line, Daniel scanning the crowd of children for Lily's familiar backpack. He heard the car before he saw it, an engine too loud for a school zone, tires braking a little too sharply, and when he turned, there was Rachel, stepping out of a gleaming black sedan in sunglasses she didn't need at 4 in the afternoon, laughing at something the man beside her had said. The man was younger than Daniel, dressed in an expensive but slightly ill-fitting blazer, the kind of outfit someone buys to look successful rather than because it fits their actual life. Rachel spotted Daniel immediately. She always did, the way people who enjoy an audience always find their audience first. And she made a show of walking toward him, her new boyfriend trailing a step behind. "Daniel," she said, loud enough for at least 4 other parents to hear, "still picking Lily up yourself? No nanny, no help? Some things never change." She laughed, glancing sideways at her boyfriend as if inviting him to laugh along. He offered a thin, uncomfortable smile instead, clearly unsure whether he was supposed to participate in mocking a man he had never met. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct to defend himself, to list his accomplishments like evidence in a trial nobody had asked him to stand for. He didn't do it. He had learned, somewhere in those 8 years, that explaining your worth to someone who has already decided not to see it is like trying to describe color to someone who refuses to open their eyes. Instead, he simply said, "I like picking her up myself," and turned to look for Lily. Rachel wasn't finished. "This is Marcus," she said, gesturing to the man beside her with the pride of someone unveiling a trophy. "He's doing really well for himself. Corporate job, great benefits, actually ambitious, you know?" The emphasis on "actually" landed exactly where she intended it to land. A small blade aimed at the version of Daniel that existed only in her memory, the exhausted mid-level manager she had left behind 8 years ago. Daniel extended his hand anyway, because Lily was watching now, standing a few feet away with her backpack half on, her small face uncertain the way children's faces get when they sense tension they don't understand. "Nice to meet you, Marcus," Daniel said evenly. Marcus shook his hand, and something flickered across his face, a half-second of confusion, like a person trying to place a familiar voice in an unfamiliar context. Daniel noticed it but said nothing. He had learned patience the hard way, and patience, he had discovered, often revealed more truth than confrontation ever could. It was 3 days later, in his office on the 9th floor of a building his own company now occupied 2 floors of, that Daniel understood exactly why Marcus' face had done that strange flicker. He was reviewing quarterly performance reports with his head of operations when a name appeared on a new hire retention file. Marcus Whitfield, client relations associate, hired 6 months ago, currently on a performance improvement plan for missed targets and repeated tardiness. Daniel almost scrolled past it. Then the attached photo loaded, and he sat back slowly in his chair, recognizing the same slightly ill-fitting blazer, the same nervous smile from the school courtyard 3 days before. He did not laugh, though the irony certainly deserved it. He did not immediately storm downstairs, though a smaller, more petty version of himself briefly imagined doing exactly that. Instead, Daniel closed the laptop, sat with the information for a long moment, and asked himself a question that had guided nearly every decision of the last 8 years. What actually matters here? Not his pride, not the temptation to expose Rachel's mockery for the hollow performance it was. What mattered was Lily, and what mattered was running his company the way he always had, fairly, and without letting personal history distort professional judgment. So Daniel did nothing dramatic. He let the existing performance review process continue exactly as it would have for any other underperforming employee, because that was the only fair way to handle it. 2 weeks later, Marcus's manager, unaware of any personal connection, because Daniel had never mentioned it to anyone, recommended termination based on missed client deadlines and a pattern of tardiness that had continued despite 2 formal warnings. Daniel reviewed the file, saw that the process had been followed correctly and fairly, and approved it, the same way he approved dozens of similar decisions each quarter. He never once used his position to make things harder for Marcus, and he never once made things easier either. That, Daniel had come to believe, was the quiet difference between power used with integrity and power used for revenge. And it was a difference that mattered more to him than any satisfaction he might have felt watching Rachel's carefully constructed story collapse. It collapsed anyway, as these things tend to. Marcus, now unemployed and increasingly aware of exactly whose company he had been fired from, panicked and told Rachel everything, that her ex-husband, the man she had mocked outside their daughter's school, was not some struggling single father barely holding his life together, but the actual owner and CEO of the very company that had just let him go. Rachel showed up at Daniel's office unannounced the following week, her usual confidence replaced by something far more uncertain, demanding to know why he hadn't told her, as if his silence had been some kind of trap set specifically for her humiliation. Daniel, sitting behind the same desk with Lily's old crayon drawings still taped somewhere in a box in his closet at home, simply told her the truth. "I didn't tell you because it was never about you, Rachel. I built this because of Lily, and because I refused to let anyone's opinion of me decide who I was going to become." What happened with Marcus wasn't a plan. It was just what happens when you build a company and run it fairly, and the truth eventually finds its way to the surface. Rachel left that day without the smug confidence she had walked in with, and something between them shifted permanently, not toward reconciliation, because too many years and too much damage stood between them for that, but toward a strange, hard-won mutual respect. She began showing up for her scheduled visits with Lily more consistently after that, less interested in performing a version of freedom for an audience and more genuinely present with her daughter, as if watching her old assumptions collapse had knocked something loose and useful. Daniel never told this story to anyone at work. He never needed to. His employees already respected him for reasons that had nothing to do with a courtyard confrontation or an ex-wife's mockery. They respected him because he showed up early, stayed fair even when fairness was inconvenient, and remembered every one of their names. But at home, on quiet evenings when Lily asked him questions about the divorce that children eventually start asking, he told her a simplified version of the truth. That sometimes people mock you because they've decided who you are before bothering to actually look, and that the best response isn't to prove them wrong loudly, but to keep building a life you're proud of quietly, until the truth simply becomes impossible to ignore. Lily, now approaching 9, still asks for dinosaur facts at bedtime and still thinks her father's terrible jokes are the funniest thing in the world. She has no memory of the tension in that schoolyard, no awareness of the boardroom decisions that unfolded weeks later, and that, Daniel has come to believe, is exactly as it should be. Some victories aren't meant to be celebrated loudly. Some are simply meant to be lived, quietly, one ordinary school pickup at a time, until one day you look back and realize the version of yourself people once mocked has become someone they now can't help but respect. If this story reminded you that quiet consistency always outlasts loud cruelty, and that the people who mock your struggle rarely stick around to witness your comeback, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about resilience, quiet strength, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard.